Thank you, Jordan. It's my pleasure on behalf of the World Affairs Council to introduce Christiana Figueres. She was appointed Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention. Okay, sure. Sounds good. She was appointed Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2010. She's been involved in international climate change negotiations for almost 15 years, serving as a member of the Costa Rican negotiating team and representing Latin America and the Caribbean. Figueres founded the Center for Sustainable Development of the Americas and has served on several boards and NGOs involved in climate change issues. She holds a master's degree in anthropology from the London School of Economics, and in 2001 received National Geographic Magazine's Hero of the Planet for the Planet Award. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Christiana Figueres.
Thank you, Mark. You didn't say the most important thing about my bio, which is I am the mother of a Stanford grad. Clearly, that is the most important thing around here. Is this microphone where it should be? I'm kind of small. Thank you. Much better. So thank you very much. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you here. I don't believe I recognize more than one face. Thank you for. Yeah, right. Bill Fuller is a good friend for many years. So here is a question: when you're at the World Affairs Council, what should you start with? Perhaps the question: how are world affairs doing at the mega level? And the answer to that, my friends, is unfortunately not very rosy, because let's start with the very clear fact that projections have us growing in our population capacity to reach 9 billion people on this planet by the year 2050. Now, currently, with 7 billion people that we have here, currently we're already pushing on the boundaries of the planet, both with food and water and energy, just because of the carbon-intensive technologies that we've been using for 100 years. So it really is a big question: what are we going to do to provide food, water, and energy to 2 billion more people, in addition to what we have now? And we're not doing a very good job of providing food, water, and energy to the 7 billion that we have here. So that is a challenge in and of itself, without overlaying the fact that not only do we have that situation, but we have that situation in the context of global climate change. Even without climate change, even without the forcing of climate, it would still be a challenge to provide food, water, and energy to 2 billion other people. But with climate change, that challenge is amplified, it is magnified, because that is what climate change does. It actually magnifies, accelerates, magnifies and accelerates the nexus between water, energy, and food. So one way of looking at climate change is, well, in order to address climate change, what we have to do is to build a very complex framework, the purpose of which is going to be to facilitate and accelerate actions at all different levels of governance, plus provide a platform for major private sector investment in the right direction. And that is absolutely true, and that's my day job, so we can talk about that later if you want. But tonight, I wanted to pose a completely different aspect. And I wanted to posit to you that climate change is ultimately a choice. And it is a choice because the future that we're going to have tomorrow depends on every single decision and every single choice that we are making today. And we basically have two different tomorrows. So let's look at the two different tomorrows. There are seats over here if you would like, way on the left. Welcome. So let's look at these two different tomorrows, okay? The first choice. The first choice is basically business as usual. Everybody continues doing what we have been doing. Now, the danger with that is it doesn't seem like a choice because, you're just doing the same thing that you're doing, so you don't have to really choose. But the fact is that it is a choice by default. And it is a pretty dangerous choice because even though it's business as usual, it leads to very unusual circumstances. For example, it would lead to 4 degrees centigrade, which is 7 degrees Fahrenheit increase, average temperature rise around the world. And I say average because some areas would actually reach 16 degrees temperature rise. For example, sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, some areas in the tropics. And just so that we know it's not so far away, Southwest United States, I will have you know that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has created a misery index. This is not a term that I'm inventing. This is something that the Climate Change Center at the U.S. Department of Agriculture has created, the misery index, which is a combination of heat and temperature. And they have already projected that Southwest United States will have an exponential increase in number of days over 100 degrees, with the effect that a lot of the cattle and animals will be dying, and of course with the effect that we already saw last year of severely reduced harvesting potential and crops. So it's not very far away. San Francisco. Well, the California Climate Change Center projects that if we continue on business as usual, that choice, it is a conscious choice, has to be a conscious choice, that if we do that, San Francisco could be anywhere between 2.5 to 4.5 feet higher sea level, which means that there would be flooding threat for 250,000 people, not to mention the levees that are currently trying to protect Silicon Valley. So, point here is nobody is immune to the challenges of climate change. And the latest study that I've seen says that 80% of the U.S. population is already today affected by some kind of climate change. 80% of the U.S. population. So that's one scenario. And please do not think about that as simply not doing anything, business as usual. It has got to be a choice. If that is where we're heading, then we have to say that is where we're heading, and we have to figure out how we're going to survive that. But we can't just blindly walk into that kind of a future. Okay, that's one. Now, the second choice that we have available to us, well, that's a very different choice because that is a choice that looks at transforming this world to not only make it very inhabitable, but to actually make it very exciting, extremely exciting. And it is a world that depends on investment, depends on innovation, depends on enterprise. And fortunately, I must say, we're already seeing the beginnings of that. So let me take the energy sector to begin with. Did you know that the United States last year, 2012, installed 13 gigawatts of new wind power? 13 gigawatts. Did you know that the United States installed 3.3 gigawatts of solar, which is more in that 1 year than the cumulative solar installations that they had had in the 3 years before that? Which means, put that together, the wind and the solar, that means that 49% of all of the new energy generation that was installed in the United States last year was renewable clean energy. 49%. Is that the United States that you recognize? That's what the U.S. is doing. The press doesn't carry that news because it's not bad news, but that's what the U.S. is doing. Did you know that the United Arab Emirates, being right in the center of the Gulf states, being the major gas producer among those countries, just inaugurated the biggest concentrated solar power plant in the world, 100 megawatts. Why are they doing that? Not because they're running out of fossil fuels, but because they know that that is the technology of the future, and they want to continue to be competitive. So they're investing in the technologies of the future. Did you know, I just returned from the Pacific, did you know that there are several islands in the Pacific that are already fully renewable for their energy generation, and many more on the way to do so, for the simple reason that they don't want to continue to do, like Cook Islands is doing, 30% of their GDP dedicated to the import of fossil fuels. Now, how dumb is that when you have the sun over you for 365.2 days a year? Doesn't make any sense. So there is already extraordinary transformation happening in the energy sector. But what I've told you are just examples of what I would call incremental change, okay? Those are changes that we're making just because it makes sense. But now consider a world transformed in the energy sector. So consider that every single surface that we have can be transformed into a little mini energy generation plant. Fully possible. Consider that all the waste that we produce, you know how much waste you produce at home, you know how much waste the United States produces, every country, right? Consider that all the waste that we produce could either be fully recycled, and that which is not fully recycled would be fully transformed into energy. And we would not have waste. Fully possible. That is a transformed world. Transportation. Well, you know that electric vehicles are on the up and coming, right? I've seen quite a few electric vehicles. I'm the proud driver of a Prius, which is a hybrid. And yesterday, we drove in a fully electric vehicle, which was quite a fun experience. And I've seen quite a few electric vehicles here on the streets in California. Now, it's not just California. It's certainly Europe. And in New York, Mayor Bloomberg has already announced that by 2019, 20% of the parking spaces in New York City are going to have individual recharging stations, because he knows that that's at least the number of electric vehicles that there are going to be in New York. And did you know that every single airline around the world is now changing the practices that they have for takeoff, flight, and landing and taxiing in order to minimize the fuel that they're using, because fuel is getting too expensive. But that means that they're using less fossil fuel and they're emitting less. So in the transport sector, incremental change going on. But now think the world transformed in the transportation sector. What would that look like? Well, that would look like driverless cars communicating with each other in order to decide on their own what route to take and at what time in order to get you to where you want to go, but maximizing the roadway capacity and the fuel being used for the vehicle. Entirely possible. Now, consider electric cars, fully electric cars, that would no longer need Major Bloomberg's charging stations, but that would actually be charged by just driving over the roads that would have inserted into them the inductive power capacity to fuel and charge the cars as they drive over the roads. Entirely possible. Consider huge plantations of algae, which could be even on the buildings, on any flat surface, that are being transformed into biofuel for the airplanes. So no longer fossil fuel aviation, all biofuel. Entirely possible. A transformed world. Buildings. Yes, buildings are very important. 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from cities. 80% of the world's population lives in cities. So where do we really need to look at bringing down emissions? Cities. What's in cities? Buildings. Homes and buildings. So we know already that green buildings, the LEED certified buildings, are already the buildings of choice, right? Because they just wear better. They're actually, even though they have a premium price, they actually are very much in demand by those who are buying buildings and occupying buildings. And we know that these buildings already have LED lighting, and some of them even have what they call smart thermostats, which actually learn your practices, your heating and lighting practices, and then help you choose when do you actually consume the energy in order to bring down your electric bill. So all of that is already there. But now consider buildings in a transformed world. Well, buildings in a transformed world would be buildings in which you no longer have to bring electricity in. We basically think of a building, as though it were a country. We are importing electricity into our buildings. We're buying electricity into the buildings. And we bring food that we need into the building and we transport it. Now consider a transformed world in which each building would actually produce all the electricity that it needs, because it would have all of these flat surfaces with all kinds of panels that produce electricity. In fact, it might even produce more electricity than it needs and sell back into the central system. Consider buildings that would actually capture as much water as they need for the food that is being produced on the roof and on terraces of the building. I already saw it in Singapore. So what about a transformed world in which we would actually plant cities instead of building them? Because that's the way we would think about cities, living organisms that we are going to plant and plan instead of just building them with cement. That would be a transformed world. So, it may sound like science fiction, but I assure you that this is very quickly becoming science fact. Many of these technologies, in fact, every single one of the ones that I have named, is either already here or coming just around the corner. So the choice is a very clear choice. And the benefits are even clearer, okay? The benefits of choice number 2, if you remember, this is sort of like, what is that TV thing that you have, door number 1, door number 2? What is that TV series? What is it called? There you go, Price is Right. So door number 1, door number 2. So here you have door number 1, this horrific scenario. Door number 2, we have this absolutely exciting world that we could live in. And what are the benefits of door number 2? Well, the benefits are, obviously, we avoid the catastrophic rise in temperatures that we do not even want to experience. We have increased food security, increased energy security, increased water security. We would have developed a low-carbon growth model that actually contributes to economic stability, that improves public health and happiness, by the way, contributes to job creation in completely new sectors, and keeps natural resources, safeguards natural resources for future generations instead of gobbling up everything that we have now. Because there are future generations to come. So what is there not to like about that world, I ask you? It is the fabulous world that we should be heading for. Now, you'll probably ask, so you work for the UN, so what the heck is going on at the global level in order to usher in that, future that we want? Well, let me tell you quickly, and then we can go into some discussion later if you want. What is being done to address climate change? Because this future that we're talking about is basically the successful address of climate change. If we successfully address climate change, that's the future that we're looking at, which is actually a pretty cool future. So what are we doing? Well, at the global level, first, countries, governments, who are the ones who negotiate the climate convention, have gone into a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, the United States signed and then exited the Kyoto Protocol, so it never participated in the Kyoto Protocol. But every single other industrialized country participated in the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Some have now left the second, but those who are left have actually gone into now an 8-year period during which they have legally binding emission reductions. And they will be doing that from now until 2020. That was a big negotiation, difficult to come to an agreement, but they have finally agreed to do that. Governments have furthermore recognized that because the Kyoto Protocol only covers a few countries, let's call it 10 to 12% of global emissions, that they would actually need to take another step. And so they have committed to agreeing by the year 2015 to a universal agreement that covers everybody under the same roof, and that would go into effect by 2020. And governments are now very, very arduously preparing all of the material that they need in order to be able, over the next 2 years, to come to that agreement. The next step is actually just next week in Bonn, where we work, and there all the countries of the world are coming together to begin to look at how are they going to walk down this path over the next 2 years. At the national level, that's in the international. At the national level, what do we have? Well, we have an impressive number of countries that have actually passed climate change legislation, and the one nearest to us here is Mexico. Probably the country in the world with the most ambitious and comprehensive climate change legislation, really quite a model for everybody. And Mexico, why did they do it? Because it is in their own interest. And you have 30 other countries that have passed some kind of climate legislation. You have 100 countries that have passed renewable energy legislation, and more than that have all kinds of incentives for energy efficiency. So at the national level, we are moving forward. Private sector. What's the private sector doing? Well, we already have $1 trillion invested in renewable energy, and every day more and more companies are seeing the risks that climate change poses for their company. They're beginning to disclose their carbon footprint, and they're beginning to take on even voluntary reduction commitments because they understand that they also have to contribute to the solution. So things are moving forward at the international, at the national, and at the private sector. Is that enough? Definitely not. It is not enough. And at the international, at the national, and at the private sector level, everybody needs to do much more. But even if they do, that is still not going to be enough, because that is where all of you come in. Making the choice of what kind of future we want is not a responsibility that we can export or delegate to federal governments or to national governments or to international processes or to the private sector. It's a choice and a decision that every single individual needs to make as well. And the fact is that we're not powerless in front of these planetary boundaries, okay? We're not powerless. We have the capital, we have the technology, we have the human ingenuity. Now, all we have to do is choose to focus all of this on creating a very different future than what we would have if we don't focus all of these things. It's a choice. It is a choice. Now, every single consumer, you're all consumers without an exception. You have the power of the consumer. Every single investor has power. Every single philanthropist has power. Every single student, every single professor, every single policymaker. With every decision that you make in your life, you are sending a signal of what kind of future you want. And to summarize the futures, it's very simple. It's either a future of intense heat or a future of cool technologies. That's the summary. And that's what you need to choose. So I realize that this challenge that we have today, all of us collectively around the world, is not an easy challenge. And it's not a moment that calls for the weak of heart. It certainly is a challenge that calls for strength of mind, for strength of will, and for strength of choice. But my dear friends, all of you have that. And so the question that I want to leave you with is tomorrow morning, because hopefully you're not making too many important decisions tonight, but tomorrow morning, the first decision that you make, think of it as a choice. And think, is this a choice that supports the business as usual, or is this a choice toward the future that I know that you want? And the answer, my friends, is in your hands. Thanks.
So we're going to move on to ask some questions. And so we've gathered some audience questions, and I'll read some of them and stand there to answer. So let me start by, what do we say to developing countries that see emissions reductions as an affront to their economic growth? So in other words...
I got it.
Yeah, I got it. Okay.
It is one of the challenges because the growth, the economic growth that we have had over 100 years, which has basically been concentrated in industrialized countries, in the North, as we call it, has been a growth that has come on the back of burning fossil fuel. So if you look at it as a curve of growth, you can see the curve of growth, and you can see the curve of greenhouse gases and the incremental curve of the use of fossil fuels. All of those three things in parallel with each other. Well, so when you go to the developing countries and you say, by the way, you, of course, have the right to continue to develop because you still have poverty levels and people that you need to lift out of poverty. You can continue to develop, but you know what? You can't do it the way we did because we've already emitted all the carbon up there in the atmosphere, and now you have to figure out how to continue your growth but do it differently. Well, that's a major task for developing countries, okay? So what needs to be guaranteed to developing countries is that nobody is going to curtail their growth because they have to grow. Those are the engines of growth. It is the developing countries that are the engines of future growth. So we cannot curtail their growth, but we have to provide them with the technology and the finance to be able to make the leapfrog over the fossil fuel slavery into a renewable energy, into a clean technology future. And they have to be able to access that so that they can then grow. Think of it, it's very similar to the cell phone, okay? I spend a lot of time in developing countries, and it is fantastic to go into the boonies of, any tiny little developing country, and in the boonies, you will see a woman walking around with a cell phone, okay? She doesn't have electricity at home. She has to go and get water somewhere down the river. She has to walk 3 hours to go and get firewood, but she has a cell phone that she charges with her little solar panel. Now, the fantastic thing is those people completely did a leapfrog over this stupid landline thing that we had. Do you remember the technology of landline? Where you had to get a long cable to get your phone? Well, how 5 minutes ago was that? And developing countries have just completely jumped over that technology and said, we don't need it. We can just go straight to the cell phone powered by solar panels. That's the kind of leapfrogging that we need, and multiply that times 100. And it is possible.
Thanks. Next question, how should we balance prevention versus adaptation? Like prevention of future warming versus adapting to
whoever asked that question, does prevention mean mitigation, reducing emissions? Is that what you mean?
I think that's what it means.
Is that right? Okay. Well, sadly, we have to do both. Okay? We have to do both because the fact is that we already have so much climate forcing. We already have so much concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that the system is already loaded toward the kind of events that we've already had toward the Sandies and the droughts in the Southwest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not getting rid of those, okay? The only thing that we are doing is trying to avoid worse impacts. But that kind of impact you can all count on. And this side of the room, the younger generation are the ones that are going to pay that price, thanks to us, okay? Because we're doing it. That generation is going to pay the price because they will live their whole life with the Sandys and the droughts and all of that. The only thing that we can do now is to try to avoid that those impacts get even worse, that they be more frequent and that they be more intense. So we have to bring down emissions and we have to do adaptation because cities such as New York will be affected and they need to prepare ahead of time. They're investing gazillions of dollars into adapting, for example, the entry into subways in New York because they know that they are now bound for the kind of thing that they had with Sandy. So we have to do both. It's very expensive, but we have to do both.
Thank you. How do we convince the private sector to invest in renewable technologies?
Well, we don't have to convince them. We have to give them the conditions in which then they will jump in. And the conditions are we have to give them an international policy framework that makes sense. Then we have to have at the national level a policy framework that is coherent with the international policy and that actually gives the private sector incentives and predictability so that they can actually make their investments. And we have to buy down the risk. Governments have to be able to step up to the plate and say, okay, I'm going to partake of the risk. Because private sector, I have news for you. Private sector is motivated by profit. And there is no private sector company that is not motivated by profit. I don't know one private sector company that makes an investment without making profit. That is their terms of reference. And if that's not the way, and that is actually a very powerful motivation. So instead of condemning them, let us put in the kinds of frameworks and the kinds of structures that are necessary to attract private sector investment because we want them to develop the buildings that produce energy. We want them to develop the buildings that produce food. We want them to develop the kinds of roads that are going to charge cars. That's the private sector that needs to do it, but they need to have a certain predictability and a certain rate of return.
Thanks. Okay, which country has it right in terms of environmental policy?
None.
Or close to right.
My own, but I can tell.
Okay. That's next question. What will it take for the U.S. to take a leading role in stopping climate change?
It takes every single one of the U.S. citizens to speak up. That's what it takes. I live in Europe, okay? I cannot tell you. I live in Bonn, Germany, because that's where the headquarters is. But I was educated in the United States. I still believe in science, despite the fact that I was educated in the United States. What happened to science? What happened to science? Why do people not believe in science anymore? What, did it go out of vogue or something? Here we have a scientist sitting right here. What, should we put him in a museum? Well, you answer. What happened to science in this country?
Well, yeah, we're competing with bloggers. That's what. That's what
No, but I'm serious. There's got to be more awareness in the United States, in the citizenry. You have got to be more aware. You have to become more conscious of what we are doing to future generations. You would not deliberately take your assets that you have and bury them in the ground, would you? You protect your assets because you know you're going to have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Well, that's what we're doing. We are taking our assets and burying them in the ground.
Okay. Next question. What do you think of a carbon tax as a disincentive for fossil fuel use?
Well, I come from Costa Rica, and I come from a country that has had a carbon tax for 15 years. So I think it is a fantastic way of sending a very clear signal that we cannot be irresponsible with the way that we use fossil fuels. Do I think it's politically realistic in the United States? Answer. Put up your hands if you think it's politically realistic in the United States to have a carbon tax. You do?
Yeah, about 2014, 2015.
All right. I am excited. Okay, that is fantastic. That is much more hopeful than I am. I mean, if you think that that's possible and if that can have bipartisan support, hey, I'll be here. I will be here. I will be cheerleader number one. Because it is, let me just say this, a carbon tax or any other way of putting a carbon price is actually, from an economic point of view, the most effective and efficient way to do this, okay? You can regulate and you can do, all kinds of things. But nothing is as strong a market signal to the private sector as a carbon price, whether that be a carbon tax or whether it be a cap and trade, which is what California is doing, or any of the other measures that ultimately give you a carbon price. But that is the simplest, cleanest, most powerful signal. So if that's possible, I'm with you.
If you could write a global climate agreement that applied to all countries, how would you implement the principle of common but differential responsibilities so that it applied fairly to all countries?
I have to write one that applies to all countries. This is my task. So how are we thinking about that? Well, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is a golden principle in the convention. And basically what it means is that there are two groups of countries. One group of countries, all the industrialized countries, that have reached the development level that you have based on the burning of fossil fuels, and therefore you have what we call the historic responsibility of 100 years of burning fossil fuels and putting them in the atmosphere. Not that your great-grandfathers knew that, right? 100 years ago, nobody knew the cost, the environmental cost of burning fossil fuels. But nonetheless, that is the historic responsibility that the United States shares. Well, shares is actually a diplomatic way because the United States has a huge chunk of that responsibility, but it shares it to a certain extent with the other industrialized countries. Then there's a group of countries, all the developing countries, that have no historic responsibility because they have not contributed historically to the concentration of greenhouse gases. However, there are some countries in that group, not all of them because there are 130 of them, but there are some countries in that group, 5 or 6 countries, that are going to be very clearly responsible for the growth of emissions in the future. So all of the emerging countries, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, all of those countries that are burgeoning and that are coming up and becoming very quickly, developed countries, that's where the growth of emissions is going to be. So the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities says, okay, you guys who did it in the future, you have to pony up, step up to the plate because you have this historic responsibility. And we, in the South, we don't have that, so you need to take the lead. And that is going to continue to be so because nobody's going to change history. We're not going to rewrite history. So yes, industrialized countries have to continue to take the lead. There is no doubt about that. Is it only industrialized countries that are going to solve the problem? No, because the others are going to create the problem in the future. So the way to get around that is a concept that we call equitable access to sustainable development. And what that means is not the principle of not curtailing, as I said before, not curtailing developing countries their right and their possibility to grow and to pursue their economic development because of environmental impacts that the North has caused. So how do you open up the possibility for the South to continue its growth without having the environmental footprint that the North created in the past? That is something that still needs to be developed, and a lot of thinking is going into that to figure out how do you guarantee that possibility for the developing countries.
Okay, so I'm very passionate about climate change. However, I find myself doing the very things that cause this, such as driving my car. What needs to happen for people like myself to change our behavior?
Ride your bike. No, I'm serious. I mean, when you think about it, as I said before, every single thing that we do, every behavior that we have, every activity that we incur in, and I'm looking at the lights in this room, have an impact. And if we're unaware of it, then we are really conserving that high carbon economic model, and we can do things very differently. I'm actually getting too old to think about different things, right? But I remember, in fact, just, I don't know, 10 years ago, my daughters were still home, and I went, it was the heat of summer, and I went to some whatever, and bought ice cream cones and ice cream, and everything else. I came home on my bike, and I put out the ice cream, and I pulled out the ice cream cones, and my daughter went, "You have got to be kidding, Mom. We're going to eat those ice cream cones." I thought you wanted ice cream cones. Have you seen how they're packaged? And I went, "No." She said, "Let me show you." So she took the package of ice cream cones, okay? And there's a package, and then you lift the thing out, and then there is a plastic bag, and then you open that plastic bag, and inside the plastic bag is another box, and then you open that up, and then finally there's a mold to keep every single ice cream cone in perfect shape. 4 layers of packaging. Okay? Now, because I'm so old, I would have just immediately, picked up the ice cream cone and said, "Here you go." And she says, "We're going straight back." So all of us get on our bikes. We're going straight back to the supermarket. "Manager, come here." And my daughters lecture the manager. "Do you know how irresponsible it is to carry this kind of ice cream cone? Let me show you about the packing." And they go through the whole ritual, And I'm standing there going, thank God for the next generation. That is the kind of information that consumers need to give. Thank God for the next generation. I would have blindly just used those stupid ice cream cones. That's the kind of awareness that we need. That is the message.
What policy reforms do you see as most critical in the short term in the United States with a struggling European carbon market and several efforts to repeal state RPSs?
What is the most important policy thing for the U.S.?
Yeah, policy reforms in the short term.
Well,
renewable portfolio standards.
Well, I'm not sure what the most important thing is. Let me say the most effective thing would be a carbon price or a carbon tax. What is in the pike? What is in the pike is actually EPA regulation. So I'm sure that you all know that federal EPA, independently of California, that is way ahead, but federal EPA has regulated standards for vehicles, a little bit better than they were before, way behind China, of course, which is much, much more efficient, way behind European standards, but at least a little bit better to what they were before. And they've also regulated emission levels for any kind of new power plant that would have to be built. The next step for them, once they get those 2 chapters finished, which they haven't yet, the next big step would be to regulate currently generating energy plants. And that would certainly help to clean up at least the coal in this country. Because if there is a fossil fuel that really is absolutely just unforgivingly contaminating, it's coal. And cleaning up the coal in this country would take us a long way forward.
Thanks. When you go to an international climate negotiation, who is pushing back? What are their excuses or arguments?
You mean other than the United States?
Yeah. Yeah, probably.
So who sits over with the U.S. in that corner? The fossil fuel exporting countries and the United States. It's a very interesting group.
Are there kind of subgroups aside from countries? Like, there's more lobbyists, like like from the fossil fuel industry?
Oh, yeah. I mean, these meetings that we organize are 25,000 people. And maybe 10,000 of them are government representatives, and everybody else is, trying to get some kind of an influence. But the decisions in the text, the decisions made, and the decisions about what legal text emerges is only done by governments. So it is typically the fossil fuel exporting countries, because the companies do not have an opinion, because that they're not allowed. This is an intergovernmental process. So it usually is the fossil fuel countries that are resistant for obvious reasons. The United States has been pretty resistant. Who are the ones, but perhaps more interesting, who are the ones who are pushing forward? The ones that are pushing forward are certainly the 43 small island developing states. They're called the SIDS, for also very obvious reasons, because sea level goes up and they drown. In fact, you have several heads of state of some of those islands already looking for where are they going to migrate their population, because they know that they're going to lose their homeland. So they're already looking around to find out where can they lease or buy land, because they're going to have to move their entire population. It's very, very sad. So certainly the small island states are the ones that push most. Another group that is called the LDCs, which are the least developed countries, which are the poorest countries of the world, they also push, because they are very, very, very vulnerable. Most of them are in Africa, and most of them will be hit. Most of them live already around the desert and will be submitted to increased desertification and increased drought and increased heat, which means less water, less food, and less capacity to survive. And what is fascinating to me is that the military in the United States has recently, about 2 months ago, come out with a report saying that they now recognize that climate change is one of the most serious security threats to the United States. Why? Because they realize that all of these people that are going to lose their land, where are they going to look? And what relocation are they going to want? And so the military is now actually pushing the government to address climate change much more effectively out of a self-protection interest, a very powerful motive.
Well, there are a couple of questions about overpopulation, so I'll read one of them. Transformed world sounds great, but the world's population will continue to grow, and the Earth's resources are finite. How are we as a species going to deal with the fact that we will eventually exceed the Earth's capacity for people?
Well, that's the picture that I'm trying to paint, right? That we don't have to exceed the Earth's capacities. That is, if we're much, much smarter about the way we feed ourselves, the way we transport ourselves, the way we the way we create energy, then we don't have to exceed the Earth's capacity, and we can actually stay within the planetary boundaries. But it does mean very, very, very different technologies, and it means very different behavior.
Okay. How can micro-crediting and microfinance be used to help lesser developed countries develop in a more sustainable manner with climate change in mind?
I have to share with you something that I saw yesterday that is so way cool. So in Silicon Valley, there is an entire building that is dedicated to small up-and-coming startup companies that are developing different kinds of solar energy technologies, the whole building. And I visited 3 of them, and here's what they're doing. One of them is developing a solar technology that can construct a mini grid, which means a small system, interconnected system with wires, but a small system to power, let's say, a village. Okay, so let's say 100 homes. And they have their large solar panels and producing electricity, and then they have the cables going out, and they dig them under the earth, and they go to the 100 homes. And we're talking, some godforsaken little village in Kenya. So they have these big solar panels. They have all the cabling going to each home. And they know exactly, here sitting in Silicon Valley, they know exactly the name of the owner of each home, who has already signed an electricity contract with them. And through their cell phones, because they all have cell phones, through their cell phones, not only do they buy time on the phone because it's all pay in advance, through the cell phones, they buy kilowatt hours of electricity. So according to however much money they have, they'll buy whatever, $1 or $2 a month of electricity, and that's how much electricity they can have. And the system is so smart that if somebody runs out of kilowatt hours, the system itself cuts the electricity in that person's home here from Silicon Valley. Now, how cool is that? Furthermore, how are they financing this whole thing? Because it's about microfinance. How are they financing this whole thing? With a crowdfunding system where this thing costs, I can't remember what it was now. I think it cost like $90,000, and they put it up on a website that says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to electrify this village that has never had electricity. They've always used light from kerosene lamps. And it costs, whatever, $90,000. And who wants to invest? And then you can, as a citizen, invest $5, $10, $25, $1,000, $10,000. And you invest, and you get a return guarantee of 4.5% rate of return for your investment. And so among, 1,000 people, they have the money that they need to put up the solar panels in this little forsaken village in Kenya. Now, that is the way of the future. You don't depend on, big financial transactions, but you depend on people like you and me sitting there going, well, I have $25. What should I do with it? Well, what better to do with your $25 than invest it in solar energy in Kenya? And then we all get together. All of us here in one room, we could power a village right now, like that. It's very, very, very cool. And the way that they make it actually feasible is that they really do have very, very strict rules about, okay, you don't pay, we turn it off. And you can say, well, that's inhuman. But the problem is, if they continue to produce electricity without being paid for it, then it's not a business anymore. And then they won't be able to produce more solar panels for more villages, et cetera, et cetera. So they do have to be entrepreneurial about it. But the fascinating thing is that they have absolutely no defaults, because people are so happy about having electricity. So it's very cool.
Is natural gas fracking a necessary evil to help bridge the gap between current energy technology and more sustainable technologies? Loaded question.
Is it a necessary evil? It's very difficult to answer that question for any specific country, because the conditions, the energy matrix, and the economic conditions of every country are so unique. So I wouldn't be able to say, is it a necessary evil to have gas fracking, wherever that's possible in the world, because it really is a decision that needs to be taken at a national level. What is very clear is that you can't go into that blindly thinking that there are no impacts. The impacts are severe, and you have to be able to deal with those impacts and mitigate those impacts if you're going to go into that, what did it call it, necessary evil.
In a place like China, where the oil industry is state-owned, will this cause a conflict of interest when it comes to promoting renewable energy?
No, because the state is the one that is actually investing in renewable energy. And in China, you have the state, but you also have these mixed private-public companies that are partly state and partly private. So the state invests, the state has the policy. They have very, very stringent policies on the new generation, how much of it has to come from renewable energy, also on energy efficiency. So the state puts in the policy, and they also invest in the research and development of the technology. But then it is these public-private companies that actually generate, absolutely according to the policy of the state.
Thanks. A lot of solutions you mentioned are market-driven. What happens when there is a market failure, meaning the markets do not reflect the externalities, such as pollution and climate change?
Well, the market is not reflecting. That's the whole point. The markets are not reflecting right now. It's very, very few countries in which you do have a carbon price that is actually internalizing the impact of carbon, and that is the big failure. The big failure is that the market is not. The economy that we have, the economics, the whole science that we've developed around economics has not been pushed to internalize the value of, or the cost, actually, the environmental cost of carbon or of the use of any other natural resource. So the same can be said for water. We really haven't internalized the cost of water in many of the production systems that we have. We certainly haven't introduced carbon. But that is for the economists to deal with.
Okay. So what are some of the obstacles the U.S. faces in becoming the dominant power in renewable energy?
What are some of the obstacles?
Yeah.
Well, you'd first have to compete with China, because China is already the leader in solar. China is already the leader in wind. Second in wind. And they are, that train has left the station. They have no intent of giving up that leadership. So, if the U.S. industry wants to come from behind now and pick up and reach that, it's going to require serious investment in research and development, and it's going to require serious investment of companies that really want to go into the production and that are willing to compete with China.
Okay. Last two questions. First, is energy independence a worthwhile goal for a given country?
Totally. Energy independence, oh my gosh, it's so important. It's important for large countries, it's important for small countries. I just spent some time in Fiji and Tonga and New Zealand, and it's really very impressive how those Pacific islands are actually moving toward energy independence, because they don't want to spend all of this unnecessary money on fossil fuel. And for them, it's much more it's very little fuel that they import. So for them, it's actually the cost. For larger countries, it's actually the political risk of somehow somebody turning off, and here you are depending on a friendly country delivering fossil fuel to you, and all of a sudden there's a change in the political relationship, and that country doesn't deliver fossil fuel to you anymore. So yeah, energy security within your own boundaries is absolutely critical for any country, big or small.
Okay, thanks. And finally, what more can the UN do to put a price on carbon?
Well, that's what we're doing. That is exactly the whole support that we're giving to countries is actually for them to come up with an agreement on how they are going to put either a direct or an indirect price on carbon. So that's the bottom line. If you want to do an executive summary of the 2015 agreement, that would be it. It would be the implication of that agreement would be that there would be either a direct or an indirect price of carbon. Global price of carbon.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have. Let's thank Christiana Figueres one more time. Thank you very much. So I think this is...